Hello and welcome to the HTangl version 1 disassembly video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to completely disassemble this and reassemble it, either for adding artwork by removing the top panel or changing out your switches and keycaps for preference, or if you just want to take a peek inside and see how it looks. Either way, I'm going to walk you through step by step. So the tools you're going to need for this process are very simple, and the first one is actually included with your controller. This is a 4mm hex key, sometimes also called an Allen wrench. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, it does come with your controller, but if you ever need to get another one for any reason, it is 4mm, so keep that in mind. The other two tools are not included, but are very helpful for changing out your switches, which is what this tool is for. This is a switch removal tool. These are on several different websites. You can find them on Amazon, eBay, a whole bunch of other places for only a few dollars. I like this style with the large handle because it makes it a little bit easier to get the switches out, but there are several different styles. So that is tool number 2. And then number 3, which is probably going to be the second most important one, is a wire keycap removal tool. There are several different types of keycap removal tools. I like these wire style specifically for this controller because it allows you to kind of fish the edge underneath the switch. There is not a lot of room between the edge of the keycap and the top of this plastic panel, and this tool works really well for getting into that gap. You could also use a piece of string if you really don't want to buy this tool, but they are very inexpensive, usually only $2 or $3, so that is definitely highly recommended. So those are the only 3 tools you're going to need. And we are going to start with the keycaps since that's most likely going to be one of the main things people are going to want to change out. Again, just for preference, if you want to have, a couple different colors or anything like that. These are standard MX size keycaps, so you can use pretty much anything you want. And if you search for just keycaps on most websites, this is the style that you're going to get. So we are going to remove one, and to do that, we're going to use our wire keycap removal tool, and just like I was showing there previously, you're going to take one side of this. There's 2 little prongs here. You're going to take one side and take the corner and kind of fish it into the corner on one of your keycaps and then slide it over. So now I have that side in place and I want to get the other one. And now that this is underneath, you'll most likely be able to then get the other side underneath without much of a problem. Once it's underneath, just hold down on the controller and pull up gently on the switch, on the keycap, and it should come right up, just like that. If your switch comes out with the keycap, don't worry about it. Just separate the 2 pieces and reinsert the switch. There are somewhat imperfect tolerances on these switch plates, and occasionally you'll have a switch that didn't perfectly clip into place properly. That's not an issue, and we'll get to that when I take the switches out to show you how that works. But if your switch comes out with a keycap, don't worry about it. Just pull them apart. You can push that switch back in and then push your keycaps back on when you go to put those back on. So that's pretty much all there is for removing the keycaps. When you go to put these back on, there's a little bit of a trick to it. If you go to push it back on, you'll see there's a little plus on the bottom of the keycap, and the stem of the switch is also a little plus symbol. So when you go to put this back on, if it doesn't go on really easily and you know you've got it lined up, take the keycap and turn it once and then try it again. And most of the time, it should go on really easily. I didn't have to put much force on that to push the keycap back on. Now, if you do press kind of hard, you're not going to damage it or anything. It shouldn't take a ton of force to push that keycap on. So if you're kind of pushing, it doesn't seem like it's lining up, just turn it once, push it on, it should go on really easily. So that's really all you need to do. I'm not going to take off every single keycap, but that's really all you need to do. I can take off another one here by doing the same process. A corner, fish it underneath, get the other side on, and then pull straight up, and it should come right off. And that's pretty much all there is for keycap removal. So if that's all you want to do, you do not need to disassemble the controller at all. You just need a little switch removal tool like this and you'll be good to go. So for pretty much everything else, we need to take these 6 mounting bolts out. So that's what I'm going to show next. So we're going to flip this thing over. You need to remove the bolts from the bottom. This is Ivan's controller, serial number 3. So I still haven't shipped this one out. That's why that sticker's on there. But anyways, this is what the hex key is for. So what we're gonna do is loosen all 6 of these screws with the hex key tool. Once they're loosened, we can pretty much take them all out by hand. So I'm gonna go around and loosen all 6 of those. All right, and with those 6 bolts loosened up, I'm going to unscrew them by hand the rest of the way, all 6 of them. The top side of the bolts on the other side may fall out, and that's fine. So this one's kind of spinning on me, and this is a good point to bring up. Some of these bolts on the front face panel are a little bit loose, and that's fine. But what you may need to do is just put a finger on this side, and while you're unscrewing, kind of hold that in place, and then it'll come right out. So once you have all 6 of those bolts removed, your back panel comes off. I'll set this down. Back panel comes off, and you can see the PCB and all the parts underneath. Right over here we have our USB-C cable that connects to our Arduino. This one specifically in the version 1 is a Adafruit Itsy Bitsy board. It's basically their version of an Arduino. It's fully compatible. It uses the same microprocessor. And then over here we have our GameCube port, which is soldered directly onto the board, and it's mounted inside of this 3D printed little holder here. I'll show you a little bit more of how that works in just a second. And then we have a little dust cover over the top of it. This isn't entirely necessary, but it's again just there to kind of keep dust out and make it look a little bit cleaner. So we'll take that off for the time being and try not to lose it. Set that aside. And then everything else in here is pretty straightforward. Over here is our level shifter. This has to do with converting the voltage coming off of our board so that it can communicate with a console. And then the rest of the stuff in here are just hot swap sockets for our keyboard switches. So not much to see in here. We'll flip it back over. And now we can take this plastic top panel off in order to add artwork. And to do that, we need to take these out. You saw how some of them kind of fell out. Some of them are still stuck in there. Some of these will be a little bit tighter than others, but you should be able to kind of get your fingernails underneath this and pull it up. If it's a little bit hard to pull out, there's a trick you can do with one of the screws. If you take a screw and put it into the hole and kind of hold on to the top panel, move this down a little, and push straight down, that bolt should pop right out. If it's kind of stiff and you're finding it hard to pull up on it, just take one of those screws and push up from the other side and it should come right out. Most of these are pretty loose though, so I'm just gonna pull them out. So now with those 6 bolts removed, and you'll see we have a top half, and this side has to go in the top. You can't accidentally put it into the bottom because the holes on the bottom panel are much smaller, so these cannot fit in. So these go on the top side, and then the actual screw goes in the bottom. So we will set those aside. And now there's nothing holding our top panel in place, and we can remove that. You don't need to remove the keycaps to take the top panel off. And now that this is removed, you can put your artwork in between this panel and the metal switch plate underneath. So if you're going to do artwork, you will most likely need to take these keycaps off to give you a little bit more room to work. The cutouts in the artwork are made to fit around the switch, not around the keycap. And if I pull one of these keycaps off, and you saw once I have that top panel off, you can just pull these off with your fingers. You don't need the special tool. The tool is just there if you don't want to have to disassemble it. So once this keycap is off, you can see the switch underneath is a bit smaller than the dimensions of the keycap. So your artwork has cutouts to fit around the switch, not the keycap. So you'll need to remove all of these, put your artwork on, and then put your keycaps back on. But that's pretty simple, especially when you have the top panel off like this. So at this point, you can remove the switches. You have to remove the top panel in order to remove the switches because there isn't quite enough room for a switch removal tool to fit into this cavity. So you'll have to take this panel off, and with that off, you'll take your switch removal tool, and there are 2 tabs on the top and bottom of each switch, and you're going to take the little prongs on your switch removal tool, line them up with the top and bottom, squeeze together, hold the controller in place and pull straight up, and it should pop right out. Be a little bit controlled with your force when you're pulling up. It's pretty easy to pull up and have the switch go flying. Again, you're not really going to damage anything, but it's just kind of annoying if you pull up and your switch flies across the room or something. So just be mindful when you're pulling up on that. It doesn't take a ton of force, just kind of try to keep control over it. So now that I have the switch pulled out, you can kind of see how the hot swap circuits work. On the bottom of these keyboard switches, we have two little copper pins, and underneath the switch plate, this is the PCB we're looking at, there are two little holes right here where these pins fit into. And when you're removing them, you don't really have to worry about these pins being perfectly straight. But when you are reinserting these switches, you need to be extremely careful to line the switch up perfectly straight and then push perfectly straight down. If you're wanting to change your switches, or you just took one out of curiosity, or to maybe lube them would probably be the more likely thing. Lubing these switches will make them much quieter and a little bit smoother. So I lube my switches. It's definitely recommended if you know what you're doing and you want to take the time to do that. But anyways, when you go to reinsert these, you need to make sure that the two little copper pins on the bottom, especially this smaller one that's closer to the edge, is perfectly straight. If that is not straight, if it's bent over even a little bit, chances are when you go to push this back into the hot swap socket, that pin will bend and your switch will not register. There is a chance that you will break that pin as well, and if that's the case, you would have to replace the switch. The switches are not expensive, but it's just kind of annoying if you do break one. So just keep that in mind. Make sure these are perfectly straight, and then when you go to reinsert it, I like to set it in place. Just leave it there. Don't put any pressure on it. Make sure it's perfectly straight, and then I press down exactly in the middle, and it should just push and click into place. Once it's down in there, I like to put a little bit of force on it, and the top flexes a little bit. That's totally fine. You're not going to damage anything. Push with a decent amount of force to make sure that the top and bottom clips clip into place. Again, because of tolerances with the thickness of these plates, those clips won't always clip in exactly perfectly, but it doesn't matter. As long as it's pushed in there and it's secured, it's not wiggling around or anything, you're good to go. And then you can push your keycap back on. If you do take your switches out and put new ones in, or lube them and put them back in, and you find that a switch is not working, I would recommend just pulling the switch back out, see if those switch pins are bent, and if they are, a lot of the times you can just straighten them out, either by hand or with a little pair of needle nose pliers or something like that, and then you should be able to push it back in. Just be really careful when you're pushing it back in. And worst case, even if you break one of those pins, these switches are like a couple cents a piece, so not the end of the world. But that's pretty much it for the switches and keycaps. There's not much else on here that you would need to take apart. If you ever damaged this USB-C cable or the GameCube port, they are both replaceable. The GameCube port is a bit more complicated to replace because it is soldered to the board. So if this gets damaged, you would need to solder a new one on, which is a bit difficult because these wires are very small. The USB-C port, on the other hand, is extremely easy to replace because it just plugs directly into the Arduino. So if you ever somehow wear this port out from just plugging and unplugging so many times over so many years, these cables are available on Adafruit's website. That's ADA Fruit, and I think they're about $5, so nothing too expensive. It's a USB-C panel mount cable to micro, USB micro. Like I said, they're about $5, super easy to replace. The only thing you need is a Phillips head screwdriver. You take these two screws out, it will detach from the wood. You just unplug it from the Arduino, and then you can stick your new one on, put the screws back in, and you're good to go. For the GameCube port, like I said, it's a little more complicated. I would most likely recommend contacting me if you manage to damage this port, because it is a bit complicated to swap it out, but still doable. If you are comfortable with soldering, you definitely could swap this out if you needed to. And I'm going to show really quick how this 3D printed bracket works. There's actually a clip that is holding this port in place so that it cannot move forwards or backwards. To take it out, you have to push this clip out, and it's in there pretty tight. That's designed that way on purpose. I didn't want it, you know, moving around or to have any wiggle room. But what you have to do is push on the top here of this clip down. Let's see if I can get it out of there. This one's moving pretty easily. And once it starts to move, you can reach around to the other side and kind of pull it the rest of the way out. Let's see if I can get it here. Like I said, it was not made to easily come out because I didn't want them to fall out. That's our little clip right there that holds it in place. I push it in from the top so there's no chance of it accidentally falling out. When it's all buttoned up and put back together, this is sitting up against the switch plate, so there's no possible way for this to slide out of place. But once this is removed, you can push on the front of the GameCube port here, and it should slide out the back. I'm going to take the frame off here. Just pop that right out, unplug this. And now our frame is separated. So we have our frame, we have our top panel, and we have our bottom panel. And the only thing left now is our switch plate, metal switch plate, and the PCB. Now, I'm not going to separate these pieces because it is a quite lengthy process, and there's not really any reason you would ever need to separate these unless you really did damage to one of the hot swap sockets. But even then, you would most likely be able to just resolder from here. You shouldn't really need to ever separate these two pieces. But the way these are attached, just so you're aware, there is a Phillips head screw that goes through the top of the switch plate, runs through, and I don't know if this is going to show up on the camera. It's very hard to see, but in between the switch plate and the PCB, there are little custom 3D printed spacers that are exactly 3.5 millimeters. And that is the required space between the PCB and the switch plate for a standard MX switch. So you have a little spacer. The screw that's coming through the top of this panel comes out the bottom and then is held in place by a nylon lock nut washer, or yes, a nylon lock nut. I was about to say washer, but there's no washer. And these literally lock in place. So the way to remove these would be to hold a screwdriver on the front where the Phillips head screw is, and then you would need something like a nut driver or a wrench to then hold this in place and unscrew from the top. Because if you just try to unscrew this screw, the whole assembly is going to spin. So you have to hold this nut in place while unscrewing. So that's how it's put together. Like I said, there's not really any reason to ever have to separate these, but it's just a cool detail to have so you know how it works. So from here, that's about as disassembled as we can get this thing. I'm going to reassemble it, so just do everything backwards. And the first step would be to put this GameCube port back into place. I'm gonna grab my frame, get it over here, and just push the GameCube port back into our 3D printed bracket. And it can only go so far into the bracket. This little tab on the back of the port itself stops it from going all the way through. So that stops it from moving forward. And then this clip stops it from moving backwards. And we take the clip and go from the other side and just push it right into place. I know this is a little awkward. It might be hard to see on camera, but. So my camera died on me and I lost a little bit of footage. Unfortunately, the controller I was using in the video has since been shipped out and I only have a prototype in my possession right now. So I'm going to cover what footage I lost and then it'll switch back to the footage from the actual current version 1 controller. But basically all you missed was me putting the clip back onto the GameCube port to hold it in place. This is a prototype, that's why this little thing is sticking out here, so it's a little bit different. But anyways, so from there, once you have the GameCube port clipped back in place, and you've also plugged the USB port back into the little Adafruit board, you can flip it back over to the top, and we need to put our top panel back on first. And then we need to reinsert our bigger bolts to the top. Just something to note with these, I'm not gonna show reinserting all of them because it's pretty straightforward, but when you're going to push these back in, if you're having trouble getting these top bolts back in place, you're pushing them in and they're just not lining up for one reason or another, there's a little trick you can do to get them to line up a little bit easier, and that's to first kind of lift up on the top panel a little bit, push it through the top panel, then get it lined up with the switch plate, and then push the rest of the way down, and it should go in pretty easily. So again, basically, if I want to go do a different corner, all I'm going to do is lift up a little bit on the panel, push this into place, get it lined up with the switch plate underneath. I can kind of move this around by hand and then push it the rest of the way in, and we are good to go. So once you have those in, I'm not going to put all 6 of them in just for the sake of time. All we have to do is flip the controller back over and take our bottom bolts. There is something very important to note about these screws, and that is when you are putting that back in, I recommend starting just by hand. I wouldn't start using the tool until you have these screwed in the vast majority of the way. And when you're screwing them in, they should go in fairly easily. If you get a bunch of resistance, what you need to do is go counterclockwise, unscrew them a little bit, and they should kind of fall into place. You might hear a click, kind of like you just did. I don't know if that showed up on camera, until you hear a click like that, and then you can go clockwise and just be gentle. It should just fall right into place. If you're spinning, you're having to like crank on them. They're most likely cross-threaded, which just means these threads on the screw are not lined up with the threads on the bolt. And instead of just continuing to crank down, just back it up a little bit, start to tighten again, and it should go in very, very easily. And then once you have them tightened, just finger tight down to where it's touching the panel, that's when you can get your tool and tighten them the rest of the way. All right, back to our normal video footage. Anyways, so I'm going to get all of these screws screwed in by hand, just tight enough so that they're pretty much touching the bottom panel. And now that I have all of these pretty much all the way screwed in, I am going to make sure that my pieces are lined up. This bottom panel has a little bit of wiggle room, so I'll usually press on the sides to make sure it is properly aligned with the other panels, the frame mostly. And then we are going to use our tool to finish tightening it up. You don't want to make these extremely tight, but you do want them tight enough that they're not going to just fall out or unscrew on their own or something like that. What I do is I use the longer side instead of the shorter side, so I don't have a ton of leverage, and I just use 2 fingers because I'm not trying to super hard crank these things down into place, but we don't want them slipping out either. So I'm going to slowly go through and tighten these one at a time. If it's spinning on you, like this one is, you may have to reach underneath and hold the top half of the screw in place. And once you get some resistance, you'll hear it kind of starting to make a noise and resisting your turn. I just tighten it as much as I can with just 2 fingers, like that, and stop. And that's about as tight as they need to be. I'm gonna do that on all 6, just with 2 fingers. And now that I have those 6 bolts tightened up, I am good to go. That's literally all there is to it. Keycaps and switches are pretty easy to change out. You can change out the USB port very easily, and the GameCube port, if you know how to solder, I can always provide support for that as well. These should not die out until a super long time. Eventually, like with all plugs, USB or otherwise, plugging and unplugging so many times over so many years, you will wear these out, but they were specifically made to be fairly easily replaceable, especially the USB port. So that's pretty much it. Everything on here is pretty easy to work on, pretty easy to take apart. I'm gonna put my little dust cover back in place because I'm not using the GameCube port right now. Just pushes right in. There are also little tabs on the side of this so you can get your fingernail underneath to kind of lift it up and out. Put that back on. But that is pretty much it. With it reassembled, you're good to go. You can start using it again. Yep, thanks, bye.